We had a word for them. Veth Kai. It doesn't translate cleanly into any human language. The closest approximation is something between soft-bodied and already dead. It wasn't a slur, exactly. More like a category. A filing system. You put something in the Vethkai drawer when it posed no meaningful threat to the operational timeline. Earth went in the Vethkai drawer on day 11 of the initial survey. I remember the exact timestamp, 614.33 standard, because I log everything, compulsively, obsessively, in the way that my senior officer says will either save my career or destroy it. I logged the survey team's findings. I logged the classification vote. I logged the unanimous decision. I did not log any objection. I should have. What followed is now referenced in 8 separate consensus military reviews, 3 philosophical inquiries into the nature of threat assessment, and 1 extremely uncomfortable tribunal in which I was asked, repeatedly, whether I had noticed anything unusual in the pre-engagement data. I had. I said nothing. This is what I saw. The first thing you should understand is that I was not supposed to be there. My assignment was signals monitoring. Deep background work, the kind of posting you get handed when your superiors have decided you're technically competent but socially problematic, and they need you somewhere. Your particular habit of annotating everything with personal commentary can't embarrass anyone senior. Field Observer second rank is the consensus military's most elegant way of telling someone, we trust your eyes but not your mouth. So I was watching. The second thing you should understand is that the Kethular, the strike division tasked with planetary pacification, were not asking for my opinion. They had pacified 19 worlds in the last 4 cycles. 19. Their commander, Submarshal Grethak, had a particular reputation, methodical, patient, ruthless in the way that very organized minds are ruthless. He didn't want blood. He wanted compliance. Clean compliance, efficiently extracted, on a predictable timeline. Earth was supposed to be an 8-day operation. I'm getting ahead of myself. The survey data had come back thin. That was the first thing I annotated and said nothing about. The planet's dominant species, the humans, had achieved what the survey team classified as marginal industrial civilization. Space capable only within their own system. No energy shielding. No directed force weaponry in any configuration recognizable to consensus doctrine. Their orbital defense network was, and I am quoting the survey team's exact language here, charmingly obsolete. What they did have, in quantities that struck me as statistically unusual, was conflict history. I'm not talking about the kind of territorial skirmishing most civilizations produce on their way to maturity. I mean something I couldn't categorize cleanly, which is why I annotated it and, then, filed the annotation in the subfolder I keep for things I'm not confident about. The humans had spent approximately 4,000 years in documented continuous warfare. Not against external threats. Against each other. Every variation. Every scale. 2 individuals. 200,000. 2 continents. And, here is the part that sat wrong in the subfolder, they kept improving at it. Most species, when they exhaust the evolutionary pressure of predator threat, plateau. Their conflict-related cognition stabilizes. They stop innovating in that direction and redirect into abstract problem-solving, cultural production, resource optimization. Humans didn't plateau. They iterated. Each war fed data into the next. Each defeat became a curriculum. The survey team called this a psychological anomaly of limited tactical relevance. I called it something I couldn't quite name and filed it away at 614.33 standard. Then, I went back to my signals monitoring and drank the terrible recycled nutrient broth that my unit's replicator insists on producing no matter how many times I recalibrate the base compound ratios. The Kethular landed on day 12. They went in hard and visible, Submarshal Grethak's signature approach. The theory is sound, a sufficiently overwhelming show of force collapses resistance before it organizes. You don't give them time to think. You fill their cognitive bandwidth with the spectacle of your arrival, and, by the time they start asking tactical questions, the answer is already irrelevant. 19 worlds. Worked fine on 19 worlds. I was watching the landing feeds from my monitoring post, a quiet ridge about 40 kilometers from the primary insertion zone, and I logged what I saw. Keth-Euler heavy transports, 42 of them, descending in the classic dispersal formation. The electromagnetic interference from the drive columns was producing a sound that I can only describe as the atmosphere complaining. Trees bending. Birds, the small, panicked, irrelevant birds, going everywhere at once in a pale cloud. The humans in the nearest settlement stood in the open and watched. I logged that. They didn't scatter. They didn't run. A few of them I could resolve. Individual figures at this magnification appeared to be recording the landing on personal devices. One of them, I noted with a peculiar feeling I couldn't identify, was eating something. Just standing there. Eating. I annotated, response incongruent with expected fear stimulus pattern. Query, cultural stoicism? Cognitive processing delay? Some third option I'm not equipped to classify? Then, the Keth-Euler loudspeakers activated and Submarshal Grethak delivered the standard compliance address. I've heard it 11 times now across 11 worlds. It's not a bad address. It is clear, it is respectful, it lays out the terms of integration into the consensus with minimal ambiguity. The translation algorithms had already been running for 6 days on human broadcast data. The address was delivered in 17 regional human languages simultaneously. There was a pause. Then, one of the humans at the front of the watching crowd, I couldn't tell you why this individual in particular, except that they were standing very slightly ahead of the others in the way that people sometimes stand when they've decided something, raised one hand and extended a specific finger. I logged it without fully understanding the gesture. I would come to understand it. The first engagement happened 4 hours later, about 12 kilometers northeast of the landing zone, and it almost didn't register on my instruments because it was so small. A Keth-Euler advance unit, 6 soldiers, standard pacification loadout, had moved to secure a road junction. Textbook positioning. Grethak's forward sweep, exactly as planned. They took up position at 1847.20 standard and I logged them there, 6 icons, stable, green. By 1849.08 standard, 2 of them were down. 38 seconds. I stared at my display for what I can only estimate was about 15 of those seconds, doing nothing, which is not something I do. I log things. I always have something to log. I was briefly unable to produce output. There were no human contacts on the sweep sensors prior to the engagement. No heat signatures. No electromagnetic emissions. The Keth-Euler unit's post-contact report, filed by the 4 surviving soldiers in a state that their own medical systems flagged as elevated physiological distress, described hearing nothing, seeing nothing, and, then, finding 2 of their number incapacitated from directions that the unit's spatial analysis software, which I personally consider extremely reliable, characterized as geometrically inconsistent. Meaning, the angles were wrong. The shots came from positions that the software's threat modeling had not assigned non-zero probability. Positions that, by any reasonable assessment of the terrain, a combatant should not have been able to occupy. I pulled up the terrain mapping. There was a drainage channel running under the road. It was 0.4 meters in diameter. It was partially flooded. The survey data had marked it as a geographic irrelevance. I sat very still and I thought about my subfolder. The folder with the annotation about the 4,000 years. I drank my terrible broth. It tasted approximately like the memory of a vegetable. I opened a new log entry and typed, "They planned this before we landed." Then, I sat with that for a while. Submarshal Grethak's response was rational. Measured. He expanded the sweep pattern, deployed countermeasure drones, increased unit spacing to reduce the value of any single engagement. Standard adaptation protocol for asymmetric resistance. He'd handled this before. 16 of the 19 worlds had produced some form of early insurgency. The pattern was always the same. An initial spike of contact, then, rapid collapse as the reality of the capability differential became undeniable. He expected collapse within 48 hours. I expected something else, though I couldn't have told you precisely what. What I could tell you was this: I had now pulled every piece of available data on human conflict history, and I was finding something in it that I kept trying to classify and failing. Most species, when outmatched, perform a cost-benefit calculation. The calculation is not always conscious, sometimes it's simply that the body decides before the mind does, but it happens, and it produces withdrawal. Retreat. Capitulation. The organism or the unit recognizes the asymmetry and responds to it appropriately. The humans in my data did not appear to respond to asymmetry as a reason to stop. They responded to it as a variable to work around. I found accounts of small units holding positions against forces 50 times their size, not because they believed they could win the direct engagement, they clearly knew they couldn't, but because holding the position for long enough served some other purpose. Buying time. Drawing attention. Enabling something else to happen somewhere they weren't. I found accounts of soldiers continuing to fight through injuries that my medical database classified as physiologically incompatible with sustained physical activity. I found, and this one I sat with for a long time, drinking my terrible broth, the replicator having produced what I can only describe as the ghost of something that once believed in nutrition, accounts of human units that had been completely surrounded, cut off, outgunned, and undersupplied, who had nonetheless extracted themselves through methods that, when I modeled them, kept producing the same result. The methods were stupid. Objectively. No rational actor, facing those odds, should have attempted what they attempted. The probability of success, modeled cleanly, was negligible. They did it anyway. And, a meaningful percentage of the time, it worked. I didn't have a classification for this. I opened my subfolder. I stared at the annotation I'd made on day 11. Then, I opened a fresh log and typed 7 words that I would later be asked about, at length, during the tribunal. I do not think this will be 8 days. By day 14, the Kethular had taken contact at 23 separate locations across the primary insertion zone. None of the contacts were large. None of them involved human forces of any significant size. The largest confirmed grouping was 11 individuals. Most were smaller. Some were single operators. That was the part one kept returning to. The coordination required to hit 23 separate locations with units that small, maintaining communications discipline tight enough that the Kethular's intercept network, which I want to be clear is extremely good, I have personally observed it dismantle encrypted military networks on 3 separate occasions, had yet to isolate a single meaningful signal. They were talking to each other. They had to be. The contact pattern was too distributed, too simultaneous in key moments, too clearly responsive to the Kethular's own movement patterns for it to be uncoordinated. And, we couldn't hear them. Gretac called it residual noise. Local frequency hopping, probably crude, probably temporary, would be cracked within the next cycle. I called it something I put in the subfolder. Because here's the thing about 4,000 years of fighting each other. They'd spent 4,000 years fighting people who also spoke their languages, also knew their signals doctrine, also understood how they thought. Which meant they had gotten, across those 4,000 years, extremely good at communicating in ways that an observer who knew what to listen for could not easily find. We didn't know what to listen for. We had been on planet for 48 hours. I closed my log, drank the remainder of my broth, and spent a long time looking at the ridge outside my monitoring post, where the small irrelevant birds had mostly returned and were going about their business in the low gold light of the human sun. One of them, a brown one with a stripe across its eye, landed on the external sensor housing and regarded me with what I can only describe as professional skepticism. I logged it. I log everything. On day 15, the Kethular's primary forward depot burned. The depot fire burned for 6 hours. I timed it. Not because I needed to, the official incident report would capture the duration, but because timing things is what I do when I am processing information that doesn't fit my existing frameworks, and the depot fire was very aggressively not fitting my existing frameworks. This is what I logged while it burned. The depot had been positioned at the geometric center of the Kethular's ground footprint. Submarshal Gretac had chosen the location carefully. I'd observed the site survey myself. Equidistant from the 3 forward operating bases, well within the sensor perimeter, surrounded by a 200-meter cleared zone that the construction drones had produced in approximately 4 hours. Nothing larger than a ground-dwelling insect should have been able to cross that zone undetected. Gredhack's sensor chief would later describe the perimeter as uncompromised until it wasn't. When I heard that phrase secondhand, through the report summaries, I wrote it in my log because it struck me as the most precise description of what was happening to the entire operation. Uncompromised until it wasn't. The humans had not breached the sensor perimeter. They had gone under it. Another drainage channel. A different one this time, hand-excavated. The scratch marks were confirmed post-incident, extending from a stand of dense vegetation 340 meters beyond the cleared zone, running at a depth that kept it below the ground-penetrating sweep interval. The sweep interval was set for military-grade tunnel infrastructure. Consensus doctrine, developed across 19 pacification campaigns, had never encountered the need to scan for anything a single adult body couldn't traverse in a controlled crawl. The tunnel was 0.6 meters in diameter. I looked at that number for a long time. A human adult, according to the survey data, ranges from 1.5 to 2 meters in height. I am not a xenobiologist, but I understand geometry. I understand what a 2-meter body does in a 0.6-meter tunnel, in the dark, over 340 meters of hand-dug earth, carrying whatever was necessary to ignite a military depot. There was a word I found in the Human Conflict Archives for this. Not a technical term. A cultural one. Something close to bloody-minded. It translated approximately as the willingness to do something uncomfortable or difficult or objectively terrible, not because the calculation favors it, but because the message it sends has value that the calculation can't measure. I annotated it in the subfolder. The subfolder was getting crowded. Submarshal Gredhack called a command review at 0400 standard. I attended as an observer, technically outside my remit, but Gredhack had stopped caring about my remit somewhere around contact Site 14 and had started treating me as the thing I was, which was the only person in the operation who had been watching the humans before any of this started. He looked, I will say, precisely as a person looks when their 19-world track record has just been lightly set on fire. Observer Oreth, he said, he always uses my rank, not my name, a habit I find either respectful or distancing depending on the day, your assessment. I had prepared notes. I am always prepared. I have, at various points in my career, been praised for my preparation and criticized for my preparation, sometimes in the same sentence. They're not trying to win engagements, I said. They're trying to make each engagement expensive enough that we modify our behavior. Gredhack looked at me with the expression of a person who has heard something obvious and is deciding whether to be annoyed by its obviousness or grateful for its clarity. That is standard asymmetric doctrine. Yes, I said. With one modification. I pulled up the contact map. 23 sites now, plus the depot. I had been annotating each one with a brief analysis of the human objective. Not the tactical objective, the behavioral one. What did the attack train us to do? Site 1, we increased unit spacing. Reduced our ability to provide mutual fire support. Sites 2 through 7, we deployed more countermeasure drones. Pulled them from the orbital watch rotation. Sites 8 through 11, we rerouted the supply convoy schedule. Added 3 hours of lead time to every logistics movement. Added friction. The depot fire, we were, right now, at a command review that had pulled Gredhack and his 4 senior officers away from their operational posts at 0400 in the morning. They're not attacking our soldiers, I said. They're attacking our decision-making bandwidth. There was a silence in the command post that had a texture to it. Every contact forces a response, I continued, aware that I was now well past the length of commentary that my rank technically authorized. Every response consumes time, attention, resources, and, most importantly, produces a modification in our operational pattern. They learn the modification. They probe it. They find the new gap it created. I pointed at the contact map. This is not 24 separate attacks. This is one continuous experiment. Gredhack looked at the map for a long time. How many of them are we dealing with? He asked. I checked my models. I rechecked them. I had run the numbers 6 times in the past 18 hours because the numbers kept coming back in a range I didn't want to present officially. Between 40 and 70, I said. Across the entire engagement zone. Another silence. Longer this time. We have 1,200 troops on the ground, Grethak said. I know. I need to tell you about the soldier. Not any specific encounter, I never made direct contact. But, over the 16 days of the operation, I had accumulated enough footage, enough signals fragments, enough post-engagement forensics that a picture had assembled itself in my logs the way pictures sometimes do when you have enough data points and the patience to stop trying to force them into a shape you already expect. There was one operator who appeared, in some form, in the data from 9 separate contact sites. I say in some form because the physical evidence was always indirect. A footprint in a particular type of soil that matched a stride length I began to recognize. A specific knot configuration used to secure equipment to improvised anchor points found at 3 separate sites, always the same pattern, the kind of thing you don't notice until the third time and then can't stop noticing. A preference for operating in the period between 0200 and 0400 standard, which corresponded, I had noted, to the natural human circadian low point, the window in which human cognitive performance is most degraded. Meaning, this individual was choosing to operate at the hour when their own biology was pushing hardest against them. I found this, and I want to be precise about this, deeply concerning. The other thing I found was a habit of leaving things. Not accidentally. Not debris. Deliberate placements, each one calculated to be found. At Site 6, a single food container, empty, placed upright in the center of a position the Kethular had just evacuated under fire. A brand marking on the container that my translation algorithms identified as a civilian snack food. The survey team had logged this brand. It was, apparently, unremarkable. It was not left there because it was unremarkable. At Site 11, a piece of paper, folded, placed inside the open access panel of a disabled Kethular sensor drone. The paper contained a hand-drawn image, crude, cartoonish, of what appeared to be a large figure with 4 limbs falling backward over a much smaller figure. At Site 17, nothing was left. But something was written, in the polymer sealant on the exterior of a damaged armored vehicle, using a tool that left precise, deliberate marks. The translation took 6 hours. The phrase, rendered in standard consensus script, was approximately, "You're not as fast as you think you are." I logged this. I logged my response to it, which is something I don't usually do. My response was, I know. On day 16, the Kethular attempted a cordon operation. The concept was straightforward. Grethak had identified, through careful analysis of the contact pattern, 3 zones that the human operators appeared to be using as transit corridors. You seal the corridors. You close the net. You remove the mobility that makes the entire operation functional, and, then, the math reasserts itself 1200 against 70, on open ground, with no shadows to operate from. Clean. Logical. The kind of plan that works 19 times out of 19. The cordon went in at 0300. 8 units, coordinated, moving to seal positions simultaneously. The timing was precise. The communications discipline was, Grethak's staff chief told me afterward, the best they'd executed all campaign. By 0312, 2 of the 8 units had reported contact. Not at the cordon positions. Behind them. I have spent considerable time analyzing how this was possible. The honest answer is that I am not certain, but the best model I can produce involves the following. The humans had identified the cordon preparation somewhere in the 48 hours before execution. Not through signals intelligence, we'd maintained hard communication silence during planning. Through observation. Through watching how our units moved, what our resupply patterns changed to, which sensor drones shifted position in the preceding day. They had watched us prepare the trap and had prepared a response to it before the trap was sprung. And the response was not to avoid the cordon. The response was to be somewhere else while 2 of the sealing units discovered that they were the thing surrounded. Both units extracted intact, to their credit. The Kethular are not untrained. But the extraction consumed 47 minutes and required a response from Grethak's reserve element, which meant the reserve element was no longer in reserve. The cordon, needless to say, did not close. At 0400, Grethack's command review was shorter than the previous one. He sat at the head of the table. He looked at the contact map for a long time. "Observer Orith," he said. "In your assessment, what do they want?" I thought about this question carefully, because it was a better question than it sounded. "Not to lose," I said. "That's all. They don't expect to win. They don't have a victory condition in any conventional sense. They want the operation to be expensive enough, long enough, and complicated enough that the consensus recalculates whether this planet is worth what it's costing. And if we simply commit to the timeline? Accept the cost?" I looked at the map. I thought about the subfolder. I thought about 4,000 years of data, all of it pointing in the same direction, all of it saying the same thing in 100 different languages and contexts and scales. "They will wait," I said. "And then, they will think of something we haven't anticipated yet." Grethack was quiet for a moment. "How long will they wait?" I drank my broth. It tasted, today, approximately like the concept of defeat rendered into liquid form. "The survey data suggests," I said carefully, "that there is no documented upper limit on that particular variable. The thing about spite, I have come to understand, is that it is not an emotion. Emotions are temporary. They have metabolic costs. They exhaust themselves. Spite is a position. It is a decision that the discomfort of the current situation is preferable to the discomfort of surrender. It is the choice to make your own suffering an instrument." I had a colleague, once a xenopsychologist, stationed on the survey team for a gas giant assessment that was more tedious than dangerous, who told me that the most dangerous thing a civilization can be is convinced. Not powerful. Not advanced. Convinced. Convinced that the thing they're defending is worth whatever it costs. I had written that down and filed it in the general category of interesting but not operationally relevant. I was now finding it extremely operationally relevant. On day 17, I filed a formal request to move my monitoring post closer to the primary engagement zone. Grethack approved it without comment. I moved to a ridgeline 4 kilometers from the most recent contact site, set up my instruments, calibrated my sensors, and started a fresh log. And, at 0214 standard, the dead hour, the biological low, I saw, through a thermal scope at extreme range, a single human figure moving along the base of a ravine I had not yet noted in my terrain model. Moving without lights. Moving without apparent hesitation. Moving in a direction that I realized, with a specific feeling I had no good word for, would bring them out directly behind the position of Grethack's forward command element within approximately 40 minutes. I watched for 4 seconds. Then, I opened my calm and said 3 words to Submarshal Grethack that I had never said to a superior officer in 11 pacification campaigns. "Move your post." On day 20, Submarshal Grethack received orders from Central Command. I was not in the room when he read them. I was at my monitoring post, running a terrain analysis of the river valley to the northeast, which I had become convinced held a supply chain the humans were running entirely on foot. This conviction was based on 3 things: a subtle increase in contact activity near the valley's eastern approaches over the past 4 days, a pattern of disturbed vegetation I'd identified in the aerial survey data, and the increasingly specific feeling I developed, over 20 days on this planet, that I was perpetually 1 step behind someone who was very deliberately staying 1 step ahead. Grethack came to my post himself to deliver the orders. He could have sent a runner. He didn't. "Operational scope is being revised," he said. He was using the voice he used when he was compressing a great deal of information into a small package. "Central Command has determined that full pacification of this region may require resource allocation exceeding initial projections." I looked at him. "How much exceeding?" "They are modeling a 3-cycle deployment. Minimum. 3 cycles. The original timeline had been 8 days. They're also recommending a strategic pause in ground operations while orbital assets are repositioned." I translated this, because I am good at translating bureaucratic language. We were going to stop moving forward. We were going to wait for heavier tools. I noted the time in my log. Then, I noted a different thing, the thing I'd been watching for since day 17. In the 6 days since I'd warned Grethak to move his post, 6 days since I'd watched the thermal signature move through the dark without hesitation, the contact pattern had changed. Not decreased. Changed. The contacts had become less frequent, and each one had become more deliberate. More visible. More, I want to use this word carefully because I know how it sounds in a formal log, theatrical. At Site 21, the ambush of a supply convoy, the human operators had allowed 3 Kethular soldiers to leave the engagement zone unimpeded, in the direction of the forward command element, clearly as messengers. The engagement was technically a success for the humans, 2 vehicles disabled, no human casualties, but winning the engagement wasn't the point. The 3 soldiers they let go were. The message those soldiers carried, in their own traumatized and fragmented account of what they'd experienced, was more useful to the humans than any material outcome. At Site 22, a unit had been pinned for 4 hours in a narrow valley, not taken casualties, not pressed hard enough to be in real danger, but held. Just held. For 4 hours. Until Grethak had committed 3 reserve elements to extraction, pulling them from the orbital watch rotation for the 3rd time in a week. The humans melted out of the valley 2 minutes before the reserve elements arrived. They weren't trying to win that fight either. They were teaching Grethak's command staff that committing reserve elements was the response to their pressure, and they were doing it repeatedly until it became reflex. I wrote in my log, "They are training us." I stared at that sentence for a while. Then, I wrote, "We are learning the lessons they want us to learn." I found him on day 21. Not in person. In the data. I had been building the profiles slowly, carefully, from the forensic residue of 9 contact sites, and, on day 21 the picture finally assembled into something with edges. Male. Approximate age range, late 20s to mid-30s by human physiological markers found in the medical data I'd cross-referenced. Physical conditioning at the extreme end of the human range, not remarkable in itself, but the type of conditioning told a story. The survey team had documented 2 broad categories of human physical development, generalist and specialist. This individual's footprint, stride pattern, and the positions they were consistently choosing to operate from all pointed to something the survey team had noted and, then, classified as occupational variant. This person had been specifically trained. Not just trained for exactly what they were doing. The knot patterns I kept finding were not improvised solutions, they were a known technique, standardized and practiced, part of a documented methodology I eventually traced to a specific class of human military unit. A unit that, when I pulled its institutional history, turned out to have existed in various forms for the better part of a century. I read the history. I would like to describe what I felt reading it, but my language doesn't have quite the right category. The closest I can get is the sensation of having understood the wrong thing for a long time and only now understanding which thing you got wrong. These units were not designed for conventional warfare. They were designed for situations in which the math was already wrong, in which the reasonable options had been exhausted, in which conventional assets were either unavailable or unsurvivable. They were, functionally, institutional embodiments of the principle that the unfavorable calculation is not a reason to stop. Across the history I was reading, I found a recurring pattern. These units were consistently documented as most effective at the point of greatest disadvantage. Not despite the conditions. Because of them. As though the disadvantage itself activated something. I have thought about this for 2 years now, since the tribunal, and I still don't have a clean frame for it. The best I can do is this: most organisms, including most sapient ones, have a cognitive mode that activates under sufficient stress. The mode is characterized by narrowing, reduced creative output, reduced strategic flexibility, increased reliance on practiced response patterns. It is an efficient mode for processing immediate threat. These units appeared to run a different subroutine. Under sufficient stress, they got creative. I added this to the subfolder. The subfolder was now larger than my primary working file. The strategic pause began on day 22. Grethak ordered the forward elements to consolidate around the 3 FOBs, reduce patrol activity, maintain defensive posture while the orbital asset reposition completed. 14 days, Central Command estimated. 14 days of pause. I logged this at 0900 standard and spent the rest of the day watching the valley. At 1400 standard, I logged the following: no observed human activity in the immediate sensor range. At 1800, same. At 2200, same. The small birds had come back to my sensor housing. The brown-striped one I'd been seeing for a week regarded me with its usual skepticism. I had begun to find its consistency comforting. I drank my broth. The next morning, at 0614 standard, exactly 13 days since the first contact, which I noted in my log because I note everything, I picked up a signal. Not a communications signal. A heat signature. A cluster of them, at extreme range, in the valley I'd been watching. 14, maybe 15 individual signatures, moving in a coordinated pattern that my analysis software took 40 seconds to characterize and, then, characterized, with a confidence interval I found sobering, as organized logistics movement. Not fleeing. Not patrolling. Moving towards something. I ran the vector forward. The vector resolved on FOB3, the easternmost of the 3 forward operating bases, the one with the supply stockpile that Gredhack had consolidated into a single location as part of the pause consolidation strategy. I opened my Comb submarshal. Observer Orif. The pause, I said. They know we're paused. A beat of silence. They've been watching our patrol reduction? They've been watching everything, I said. The pause is a window. They're moving to use it. Another silence. Longer. How many? 15 that I can confirm. Probably more in the valley I can't see. For a depot? Not the depot, I said. I was running the vector again, refining it. The comms array. The comms array that handled all traffic between the ground operation and central command. The thing that, if disrupted, would extend the orbital asset reposition timeline from 14 days to an open-ended estimate while repairs and rerouting were completed. 14 days was a window they could survive. An open-ended estimate was something else entirely. Gredhack said something in his own regional dialect that my translator declined to render, which was not something my translator usually did. Move the array, I said. Observer Orif, moving the array requires, I know what it requires. Move it. The array was moved. It took 6 hours, 2 construction drone teams, and an amount of creative profanity from the engineering staff that I logged in summary form out of respect for their dignity. At 0219 standard, the human unit reached the original array position. The position was empty. I was watching through the thermal scope when they stopped. I watched them take in the absence of the thing they'd come for. I watched the pause. Then, I watched something I logged carefully, because I want the record to be precise about this: the figure I'd been tracking, the one with the knot pattern, the stride I'd learned to recognize, separated from the group and moved to the position where the array's anchor bolts had been sunk into the ground. They crouched down. Ran a hand across the imprint in the earth where the equipment had stood for 11 days. They were still for approximately 20 seconds. Then, they stood, and I could not see their face at this range and in this light, but the quality of the stillness that preceded them standing, the specific weight of it, was something I did not have a word for but recorded anyway. They had known it would be moved. Or they had suspected. Or they were simply not surprised, because not being surprised was a professional discipline they had mastered. I don't know. I am logging what I observed, not what I understood. The unit withdrew. No contact. No casualties on either side. I closed my thermal scope and sat for a long time. The tribunal asked me, eventually, what I thought the strategic outcome of the Earth campaign was. This was on day 91 of an operation that had been projected for 8 days. I gave them the numbers. 44 confirmed engagements. 12 Kethular casualties, 37 injuries. 0 confirmed human casualties, though the forensic evidence suggested the humans had taken losses they had not allowed us to document. 3 major infrastructure delays. A resource expenditure that had exceeded initial projection by a factor I was asked not to put directly into testimony. They asked me for an assessment recommendation. I thought about this for a while. Then, I said, the planet should be reclassified. Reclassified as what? The review board chair asked. Not as a threat, I said carefully, because the precise wording mattered. As a type. A category of problem that our current operational doctrine doesn't have a clean response to. What category? I had spent 2 months trying to find the right word for it. I had gone through the entire human conflict archive. I had read histories, tactical manuals, personal accounts, unit citations, official inquiries, informal records, oral histories that had been documented by xenoanthropologists before the conflict began. I had found, eventually, a word the humans used themselves. A specific word for the condition of having exhausted the reasonable options and continuing anyway. A word for the commitment to make the cost of the problem greater than the value of the outcome for the party who chose to create it. Intractable, I said. The board chair looked at me. Not the humans, I clarified. The situation. The situation is intractable. Because they make it intractable. Deliberately. It is the only weapon they have that we don't have a countermeasure for. The board chair made a note. And, in your expert opinion, Observer Orith, what is the countermeasure? I thought about the figure at the empty array position. The hand running across the anchor bolt imprint. The 20 seconds of stillness. I thought about the brown-striped bird. I thought about the drainage channels. The knot patterns. The notes on disabled vehicles. The food container, placed upright, in the middle of a position we'd abandoned under fire. I thought about 4,000 years. I don't know, I said. It was the first time in my career I had said that in a formal setting. I logged it. The review board's formal recommendation was filed 14 days later. I was not given access to it. I was reassigned, not punitively, Gretac had made clear in his own testimony, but appropriately. I was, he said, an excellent observer. I should continue to observe. My new posting is a monitoring station in a system I am not authorized to name in this document. The work is quiet. The replicator here produces a nutrient compound that is marginally better than the broth. I have, after significant personal effort, gotten it to produce something that tastes approximately like a decision I haven't regretted yet. I still log everything. On the day my reassignment order came through, I received a single file in my personal message queue. No sender identification. No transmission header. Routing data that, when I analyzed it, described a path through 17 relay nodes that terminated in a gap that should not technically have been able to receive or transmit anything. The file contained one image. A piece of paper. Photographed in low light, slightly out of focus. A hand-drawn figure, crude, cartoonish, of something with 4 eyes looking through what appeared to be a scope. And, below it, in the neat deliberate marks I had learned to recognize from the polymer sealant of a damaged armored vehicle, rendered into something that my translator this time chose to render, good eyes. I logged the file. I sat with it for a while. Then, I made myself a cup of whatever this replicator thinks it's producing, and I looked out at the system I'm not authorized to name, and I thought about the word intractable, and whether it applies in only one direction. I don't know the answer. I am still observing.